Anyway, thank you very much. Perhaps I should have introduced myself. I'm Gregory. I'm the district judge here at Muscogee Nation. And I've been very honored to have that. I have been graduated from law school in 1985 with my JD, and then I had a year at Wisconsin Law School and got my LLM from there a year or so after that, and I finally got the dissertation submitted. However, I am Yuchi, and the Uchis are part and within the Muscogee Nation. We are not Muscogees, but we are part of the nation. We, at the time of allotment in 1906, there were some 800 enrollees that were listed as with the Yuchi tribal town. We are, currently I think the Muscogee Nation has 82,000 or 78,000 enrolled members, you know? 82,000. So we have 82,000 enrolled members of the Muscogee Nation, which makes us the fourth largest tribe in the United States, behind the Navajo Nation and the Cherokee Nation, and I'm not sure who is third, but there's one other there in that area, at that size. But we're a small tribe, the Uchis. We are what we call Yuchi language is a language isolate, which means our language is unrelated to any other language known in the world, let alone this area. And I can get into that, but that would take up too much time because I enjoy speaking about that. But we also stomp dance people. Our ceremonies are very, very similar to the Muskogees. Unless you are participating in the stomp dances or the ceremonial rituals of the Muskogees and Uchis, you probably would not notice the differences. Uchis and Muskogees who take part in the green horns will notice those differences immediately, but from outsiders, they're very, very similar. But because of our language being isolated and others perceiving it as a very difficult language to learn, we were perhaps the last of the groups within the Muscogee Nation to be Christianized. And so it wasn't until about 1900 that there was a significant portion of our people who had become Christians. And Pickett Chapel was then built about the time of statehood in 1906. If you look at some of the Creek churches, some of them date back into the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. It was some years after that. That's because of our language and because I've been told that Uchis are very stubborn people. And I tend to agree with that. One of the things that our stubbornness indicates and still yet shows is our traditional funerals. Through the 1960s, the Uchis had a very extended funeral process that would last 4 days, would involve what we call Indian doctors. Other tribes might call them medicine men, but the Indian doctors would, having everything taken care of, we'd have a house in which the body would be placed. All the furniture would be removed, all things would be covered up, hooks pulled from the walls, and everything taken outside, and there would be a feast prepared by certain women, and that would be laid out on a white cloth on the floor, and the doctor would be the last one in there, and he would doctor the food and proceed out the door and close that and doctor the door. And then everybody would wait outside overnight, staying up all night, talking, visiting, and then at sunrise, the doctor would proceed to open the door, go back in, take care of the food in a ceremonial way, and then the women who prepared it would go back in and reheat it, and there would be a feast. And then the body would be buried. Now, we don't do that anymore because those doctors have gone. There's a story about the last one who knew that song, but I won't go into the details of that, but we're not able to do that anymore. However, we still have portions of what was done back then, within at least the Uchis. We still use tobacco and are very fortunate that Yoni, who is here, our chief, is still able to do that, along with a couple others. There are specific things that are done when that tobacco is given to that body to be buried. We also still place a little meal that is prepared by a certain woman to be placed with that body, and it's wrapped in a white handkerchief, and there's certain requirements for that meal, and it's placed alongside that body to be buried. We still place items of clothing with that body when it's buried, and we still have a quilt that is placed over the casket when it's placed in the graveside. And some of us still build a little fire at the head of the grave 4 days at the end. So there's still things that we do from what we used to have. We do not have what we used, all that we did, but we still have a lot. I can't speak as to what the Muscogees have or don't have, but I know that they probably have things also which are still there. One of the things we used to do was also, and we still yet do, is to wash with medicine after the grave side services. And there are several of us that do that now, fix the medicine, and it will be there at maybe at the church, or maybe at a house, or maybe wherever it is, until after everybody, that body's been put away. The attendees to the graveside return to that medicine, and they are washed by people into earth. That is spiritual washing. So because when you get down to the graveside, there are things there that you do not want to bring with you out into the world before you interact with others. So after you've gone to the graveside, you make sure that you wash, because you are, as the old people would say in Uchi, you are unclean until you have done so. Now, Pickett Chapel is where my mother grew up, and her sisters and brothers. That's a little Indian Uchi chapel. As I said, it's 5 miles south of Sapulpa. It was founded in 1906. They still had Uchi preaching there, primarily done in Uchi up till 1970 or so. The prayers were probably done primarily in Uchi through the 1980s, and we continue to sing the Uchi hymns and also Muscogee hymns there too. But as those years have gone on, we have seen a decrease in each of those items that we do because there are less and less language speakers. Mr. Spencer will talk about that in a little while. When they first built the Uchi Chapel, as do the Creek churches, and some of them still yet have it, there was camp houses that each of the families had built around the church itself. And so it would be an all-day, all-weekend affair. They would be there, they'd have church in the morning, they'd go to the houses, they might fix lunch, they'd come back to the services that evening, and they'd have a fellowship. Pickett Chapel, the last of those camp houses have been removed, but they were certainly something that older people remember, and you still see them at some of the churches. And those, I think, came from our ceremonial ground stomp grounds, because at our stomp grounds, each of the families who are regular and active members will probably have a camp there, which was built by Arbors Open Air. And that came probably from our tribal town days, because the tribal towns, the ceremonial grounds are directly come from and are a continuation of our traditional towns from the east. And some of these churches still yet, some of them have stickmen, some of them have their men and women sitting on different sides of the aisle. They have things which you can see, because many of these churches, in fact, are named after the stock grounds or ceremonial grounds that they came from when they were converted to Christianity. And so the names themselves will be from those. And some of those grounds no longer exist, but the churches continue. I don't remember how many Creek churches we have, all told traditional Creek churches. I think at one time it was 40 or 50. I'm not sure if that's still a right number, but between the Indian Baptist and the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conferences, we have still quite a few. But like you say, my family, Mom's family, all grew up there at that. Now, my daughter Billy is 28 years old, and she grew up at the stomping grounds. My wife, Dawn, who's the nominee, she may be here later. We were married at Pickett Chapel by Thomas, oh gosh, I just went blank. Thomas Long, I believe. Reverend Long had married us. And my wife, just incidentally, my wife was kind of surprised, because when she moved down here for us and we got together, first time she went to Pickett Chapel, a little Indian church 5 miles south of Sapulpa, Oklahoma. My wife Dawn, having grown up on the Menominee Reservation in central Wisconsin, goes out there, and my mom introduces her to May Tulsa, who grew up with my mom, kind of as because they had the same grandmother. And so May and my mom always considered each other sisters. And little May Tulsa walks up to my wife Dawn and says, "Oh, I knew your dad." And so it turns out that she had met her dad back in the 60s and knew all about the Warringtons, all from that. And so my wife, you just can't ever escape anywhere in any country without somebody knowing something about you somewhere. Even in Pickett Chapel, 5 miles south of on Hickory Road. Now, my daughter Millie, like I said, is 28. When she was about 2 or 3, we had a couple of different babysitters, and they had to go back to work, and so we were kind of concerned because Don was working with the public school system. We were worried about where we would do that and have her, because as you know, daycare costs a lot of money. And the Lou White, who was Yoni's mom, had adopted my wife as a sister in the traditional Indian way. And she said, "Well, my Aunt Jerry loves kids and she doesn't have any, and she'd be probably happy if you talked to her." And so we talked with Jerry and her husband, I guess, boyfriend, Snag, Norman Arnold lived there. And they also lived with Sally, Jerry's sister Sally, and their Sally and Jerry's mom, Luann Barnett. Now, this is about 1990 or so, 92, 1993. Luann Barnett was born about 1900, so at that time she was probably 95 years old. A very fluent Yuchi speaker. She could speak English pretty well, but she was very, very good speaker in Yuchi. And her mother was Lucy Tom, who was born, I don't know when, in the early 1850s. And she's about 104 when she passed away in 1960-ish. Interestingly, when 1950s, when some of the Yuchis wanted to go back and were invited back to Columbus, Georgia, which is the town in Georgia, which is closest to where our last Yuchi town site was before we moved in the 1830s. Columbus people had invited some of the Yuchis back. Lucy Tom refused to go because she said those people were mean, because her mom and her people had all said how awful they treated us back then. And she's talking about 1835. That's what Lucy Tom was talking about in the 1950s and was told to us. So our memories go back, they go a long ways. But anyway, it was a really wonderful setup, very loving for my daughter Millie. And then, unfortunately, Granny passed away. And it turns out, though, that Jerry's brother was Harrison Barnett. And Harrison Barnett married my Aunt Maxine. So I grew up knowing Uncle Harrison and Aunt Maxine. And of course, we knew Yoni's grandmother, Mary Watashi, and Nancy Jo Harry, who was married to Simon Harry, who was the chief down in Guthrie. So all these interrelationships. But Harrison decided, being a strong, one of the foundations, one of the bedrocks of Pickett Chapel, was going to, of course, have the funeral for Luann there at Pickett Chapel. And of course, because that's what we had always done, or what they had always done, they were going to have the medicine to wash with afterwards. But some of the members at that time, who were a little bit older, were probably about Uncle Harrison's age, objected. And they went to the preacher to talk about that, say, "We don't think that's right, that they should use medicine there, because this is a Christian church, and we need to go Christian ways and not have those types of things." When that was raised and brought up Uncle Harrison, he was mad. Now, Uncle Harrison was always a very quiet man. He didn't talk much. He didn't get worked up about stuff. I heard him say a lot of times, okay. But that was the most excited I ever saw him. Unless the Cowboys were playing. He was a Dallas Cowboys fan. But he got upset about that. And he told the church, or the pastor at that time, that if they did not have the medicine in the church, he was leaving the church and he would find a different place to go. Luckily, they allowed the medicine to be used there, and we continue to use and ask to fix medicine after funerals for Yuchis there. Not everybody does, that's up to the family if they want it, but they still continue. But that decision did mean that a couple of people time that has occurred. Now, what does this have to do with what we're talking about? Tribal law, Indian law, Creek Nation courts, federal Indian law. Why am I talking about this? This little one small example of a problem that we had at Bigler Chapel. If you are simply a tribal member, you have all these things you simply assume and you understand without talking about them. You don't discuss them a lot. And you talk about what occurred, but you don't actually think about the context and what it means. But if we look at it and unpack it, we are talking about something which talks about the preserving continuation of our traditional ceremonial ways, about our culture and our heritage, about how we shift in cultural patterns away from those things, how we have either adopted outside ways or how we internalize problems and we no longer follow them ourselves as opposed to saying somebody else oppressed us. Sometimes it's our own decisions. It's a question of how we take care of dispute resolution, how we make decisions and who is responsible for those decisions and how they are passed along. It also explains who we are when we get into bigger, larger contexts, is that these things are something that we may not ever talk about. You may have a client come to you as an attorney and have some issue, and you would never know this type of stuff has gone on because they don't bring it up. I had a case the other day where there was someone that came in for something, and I swore them in, they gave me the testimony, I looked at it, I made this decision, and as we were done, I said, I asked them what their last, I said, there's a lot of people with your last name out there, aren't there? And they said, yes, that is, there are. And my husband's the one that you're thinking about, there from the Stomp Grounds. I said, that's what I thought, but I simply happen to know that. I know who the context of those situations are now. In other places, maybe that's something that for state courts, there are so many people that work through the systems. We still know people in the community, but within the tribal context, even though we're 77,000 people, or 82,000 people now, for Uchis, there may be 2,000, and if you talk about those who are connected directly to the Creek Nation living within the communities, it's probably a much smaller percentage. I think there's 22,000 members who are full citizens, which are quarter blood or more. I was been told that there's 400 fluent speakers of Creek life, so it's very small communities. But all these things are hidden from the outside, but they impact the way that we as Muscogees and Uchis look at the world and how we interact with it, both the outside and internally at the Muscogee Nation, including our laws. For instance, during the summers, I don't schedule court on Monday mornings early because I know that in June, July, and August, our ceremonial grounds are very active and the green cards will be going on those Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and that if they're ceremonial people, they will be exhausted come Monday morning. And so we try to take accommodations for that during that ceremonial season. We also don't set up meetings to the extent we can. If they have a funeral at one of these Indian churches, it's going to be a day and a half affair, and the people who are involved with that church or relations are going to be out. Now, as attorneys, we expect that you're going to be extremely educated. We don't always think about that, but lawyers are some of the most educated people in the country, in our society. After 4 years of college and 3 years of law school and continuing education, we are well educated in those ways. But in order to practice in our state courts and federal courts, we assume that you know certain basic things without even thinking about it. Even very simple things that you think, well, yeah, of course everybody knows that. But those would include that we have a constitution, that there was an American Revolution, that we believe in life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that there's individual rights, that there are 50 states within our union, there's presidential elections, the Civil War and segregation which followed from it, that the Civil Rights Movement grew out of that, we had separate but equal, which must have had to be undone, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education. As attorneys, almost every one of you will be aware of that, even if you don't deal with it in a daily situation. The Federalist Papers are still cited in our Supreme Court cases. There are cases from 1985, 1996, 2000s, which are the basis for how the U.S. justices continue to decide matters. And those are 225 years old, and we don't talk about how they're too old or we need to get move into modern days. So too is with our common law. These things that I just talked about, pick and chapel as examples of what we might call common law. We talk about in Indian terms as traditions, but really in a legal context, they are common law. So I think it's important to understand some of these things and be aware of them if you were to function and be literate in tribal courts and in federal Indian law. I think that practicing in tribal courts and practicing in federal Indian law in the state or federal courts is one of the most exciting and rewarding practices you can do, because you get to do all kinds of stuff. You can do your litigation, you can do appellate work, you have an intellectual chance, you talk about tribal judges deal with jurisdictional issues all the time. Maybe others aren't as excited about that, but that's fun if you're an attorney, to me at least. But you have to have these if you're going to make sense of them as you move forward. You have to be guided by how we create, how we interpret our ways from social and cultural history. So how we can, if you look at the epics, the eras of Indian law, you will see how this comes into play. In 1789 to 1817, the Muscogee Creek Nation was a confederacy. I have mentioned these tribal towns, the ceremonial grounds. The ceremonial grounds are direct continuation or line of these tribal towns from the Confederacy in the 1700s, 1600s, 1800s. Our fireplace at Polecat, where Yoni is the chief, is literally brought from the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. That is the same fireplace where we live out in Georgia. That is same for the other 13 or 14 ceremonial grounds. At that time, 1889, 1870, the early part of the United States history, the Muscogee Confederacy created a stronger, centralized government of the chiefs in order to deal with the external forces, which were at one point France, Spain, and or the English, and then the Americans. However, the tribal town internally made its own rules and laws and enforcements. But in order to deal with the external forces, it drew forward into a confederacy. The Creek Civil War of 1812, 1814 occurred at the same time as the American War. The forces from the outside were applied to it, resulting ultimately in what was the Horseshoe Bend, Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Some of you may have heard about 1814. Some 800 traditional Red Stick warriors from the upper creeks made a stand against, we tend to forget this at the Creek Nation, many of the lower creeks who were sided with the Cherokees and Andrew Jackson. 800 of those warriors lost their lives there. And if you think of a people, if you have, say, 20,000+ citizens and you lose 800 warriors, that's a significant impact upon your abilities to continue on independence. As a result, we also had a lessened ability to resist the impositions from the United States. And they began writing down the laws that we had, including offenses against murder. It was a capital offense if you murdered another citizen. Prior to that, actually, despite what you hear often for the peace and restoration, I've mentioned this before, that the Creeks believed in blood retribution. If you killed a Creek citizen, if you were a Creek and you killed another citizen and you fled, your clan brother would be held responsible. We began to move away from that in 1819, 1820. But these wars and the outside pressures meant that one of the laws they passed was that no chief could sign a treaty without authorization of the National Council. To do so was a capital offense. And in 1825, William McIntosh, in fact, signed the Treaty of Cession of property, lands, to the United States without authority of the National Council. And he was sentenced to death and was, in fact, executed by the National Council pursuant to that law. Now, most of those articles don't mention that this Chief McIntosh was also Miko of Coweta tribal town. And Coweta was one of the 4 foundational towns of the Creek Confederacy, and it was a very important town. It no longer has its ceremonial grounds going. I'm not sure when it went out, in the 1830s, I think. So even the most powerful towns with the most powerful Micos within the nation were subject to the laws of the nation and enforcement of the laws of the nation. However, these things continued to collapse. In the 1830s, we had removal. As you can see, our history is just a series of events that are marked by major interactions with the outside. 1836 was removal. That is almost incomprehensible today, that being forced to walk from Georgia and Alabama to Indian Territory in this area. There were no roads, there were no bridges, there was no transportation. You had men, women, and children. Some of these old people can still tell stories about they have been told as to exact details of when the soldiers arrived and rounded up the people, or runners came to the villages, the tribal towns, and said that the soldiers on their way, gather what you can, we have to leave tonight. And everything that you've loved and planted, your fields, your loved ones that you have buried, everything that you see familiar. Think about if today someone came to this room and said, we are leaving for Georgia and you're going to walk there tonight, right now. Babies, old people, young people, warriors, women, children, doesn't matter, you're going right now. But we survived, nonetheless. But that made a powerful impact on us. Amazingly, despite this, we continued on and rebuilt here in Oklahoma. 1861, 1865, when the Civil War came. Now, I'm not quite sure, but I've asked some of our traditional chiefs what happened, because when we say tribal towns in the East, we meant that they were gathered in villages and towns. I think that our Yuchi town at one point, they said there was 500 gunmen. That's a lot of people, because that doesn't include men, women, and children, old, elderly people. They were gathered together, compact, organized, beautiful towns. We get out here, they were dispersed. I don't know how that happened, why that happened. Nonetheless, we rebuilt. We created farms, but the Civil War came along and our people were divided into 2 different groups. Supporting the North, supporting the South. Well, of course, the North did prevail in that. And despite the fact that there was a significant portions of the tribe which supported the North and stuck with them and fought and died for the North, the Muscogee Nation, as were the other 5 tribes, was punished and had new treaties of cession forced upon them in 1865, 1867. And partially in response to that, 1867, the nation created a written constitution, whereas I believe before that, the chiefs and Micos continued as they had done in Confederation, but in a more uniform way, from removal to 1867. We now had a formal written constitution that created the House of Warriors and House of Kings, and elected principal chief, and importantly, a court system. Now, this written constitution that we adopted, and as did the other 5 tribes, the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles, is part of the reason that we are called the 5 civilized tribes. But if you know and talk to people who are ceremonial people, our ceremonial grounds are organized, and have always been organized, around arbors where the men sit, and in the one, for us at Polecat, in the west arbor are the chiefs. Those are the chief clans, or who are capable, who are properly to be appointed to the chief positions. In our east and west arbors are the warriors sitting. And those are also from those particular clans or families which are from the warriors clans, caste. But each of us within those contexts at our grounds, and similarly within the Muskogees, as I understand it, have functions. The chiefs have certain functions they must fulfill. As I've been told, when you are a chief, you have no other option but to be the chief to make these decisions, and that fireplace comes first before all other things. The tribal town comes before anything else, family, outside matters. The warriors have their responsibility, and they often deal with the outside. Interactions, protection. The camps that we have, that I mentioned earlier, the family camps, those belong to the women. We are a matrilineal society. So the camps and the children belong to the women, and they have their responsibilities outside that square ground, whereas the men are inside. So if you look at that, then the House of Kings and House of Warriors is no different than what we actually had within our traditional structure, where there was already a division of duties between what we call the chiefs or mikos or kings and the warriors. So although the outsiders thought that they were, that we were following American system of government, I think perhaps the Americans may have learned their system of government from us, and they certainly used examples from the Six Nations who had similar structures to us also. So that was that. However, despite all these things occurring in 1867, there was continued thirst for our lands. They wanted to, part of the thing was they were going to teach us to be farmers. Now remember, we are the people who invented corn, squash, potatoes from South America, beans. I had read something when I was in college that we had a higher production per bushel acre of corn than was achieved until the 1960s with modern farming. But they wanted to teach us farming. After they destroyed everything else. Also think that we were removed from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana in 1835 between us and Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Cherokees. 1835. In 1860, what happens? There's a civil war, correct? And that was based upon slavery because it wasn't cotton plantations. Somehow, between 1835 and 25 years later, in 1860, there are these thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of plantations that arose. They did not clear those forests. They did not plant those fields in barren ground. That they were able to do so and create this agrarian economy in the South because it had been an agrarian economy under the Native Americans. But that was the stated reason, is they're going to teach us. But of course, they're also going to open up millions of acres for sale to others, the non-Indians, the white man. We resisted best we could. I think Stephanie Hudson will talk about some of these matters tomorrow and the different acts. 1898 Curtis Act, 1901 Dawes Commission, and 1906 final disposition of the 5 tribes where they cut up our land. And they thought they got rid of us, but we are still here nonetheless. And we continued on our attempts to continuing our tribal governments. And in fact, I have understood that the traditional people continued to meet and try to hold governments even through the 20s and 30s. But in teaching us that white man lays in 1901, 1906, they took our land from us, and they did not allow us to meet, to elect our own chief. Our chief of the Creek Nation was appointed by the President of the United States from 1906 to 1970. And they said that we could not spend our money without approval of Congress, and they destroyed our court systems. That's teaching us democracy, I guess. Now, Cheeto Harjo is famous within the Muscogee Nation, the Muscogee people, Crazy Snake, for his efforts to resist allotment. My mom used to tell stories about how her grandfather rode with Cheeto Harjo in the hills, trying to keep tribal members from accepting allotment or allotting process, and that actually Grandpa Gocho Jimmy had died while he was riding. Well, she said Grandpa Jimmy died while he was riding with Crazy Snake. So in order for the soldiers not to know how many men Cheeto Harjo had, they buried him under the house at night. And so we took these things very seriously, but nonetheless we were not successful. And Cheeto Harjo was supposedly killed in 1911. But I know that Philip Deere has a picture of him on his mantle, big picture, that he said was taken from 1917, so I don't know. But Cheeto Harjo was one of the more famous Indian speeches that was given to a Senate Select Committee when they visited Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1906. It is a beautiful thing. If you go to the Oklahoma State Historical Archives, it's online, you can find it. And it's a fairly long, but part of it says his talking to the senators at that time in wanting them to not do this allotment process was, I don't want these ancient agreements between the Indians and white men violated. I have always been asking for justice. I have never asked for anything else but justice. And I have never had justice. That is who our people are and continue to be. And these are, one of the things to remember is that although Chico Harjo was elected as this traditional form of the chief under the 1867 Constitution to push forward, it's important to know that he was also, if I remember correctly, the Tustanugee and Hickory Grounds, which is the second position at the ceremonial grounds. And so part of that responsibility is to communicate those directives, wishes, and speeches of the chief. So he was of that background that he carried forward into the outside on his understanding of positions. So again, all these things start tying together and we start seeing how we move forward. And now today, here we are, and we'll hear tomorrow. We may even have a decision tomorrow that could come up anytime the next week or two on this Murphy versus Carpenter Supreme Court decision, which is asking if our Muscogee reservations continue intact. And our traditional people, our ceremonial people, our old people, church people have always said that we are continuing on what we have and who we are. And so I think that tying these two things to be a literate attorney working in tribal courts is imperative that you understand not only the laws of the Muscogee Nation, but where they came from and who it is that you're dealing with. So thank you very much. We're going to take a little break. If you have a few questions, I will do that. Any questions? If not, we will take a 10-minute break. I stopped right on time. Thank you very much.